I was going to focus on three things: modern slavery, and then how a bit more about supply chain and how it touches our lives through the things we buy and use. And then I want to talk about some new technologies and some new kinds of research techniques and ways that we're using things like machine learning and artificial intelligence to help us crack slavery in different places. So that's the key things that I want to get onto. First, I'll give you some of those most recent figures. Here's a heat map of slavery around the world today. The darker colors are showing you countries where there's a higher proportion of slaves in that country's population. So you can see that India has a very high proportion, Cambodia, you can see that Mauritania does over there in Northwest Africa. If you can see a tiny little dot underneath Florida, that's the country of Haiti, which also has a pretty high level of indigenous enslavement. And our best estimate now is about 40.3 million people, conservatively, in slavery. One of the things that you don't notice at first about this map is that there are no blank or perfectly clear countries, that every single country, even the ones that have the fewest proportion of their population in slavery, still have people in slavery, like Iceland, like Greenland, and so forth. So it's an interesting fact that we can't seem to get it out of any country yet. We've got now 8 billion people on the planet, a complete collapse in price, which has occurred in the last 50 years, which has a lot to do with the glut of enslavable people around the world, and the prices, even from 10 years ago, are about the same. The average is around $90 to $100. I've met people that have been acquired for as little as $10 in places in very poor countries. Plenty of people enslaved at fundamentally no cost because they're tricked into getting with a slaveholder or tricked into being trafficked and like that. But a new world of disposable people, because they're so inexpensive, they can just be used up and tossed out like a styrofoam cup. There's one of those chaps who's disposable. These boys were enslaved to become basically like mules. They're in Nepal. They were used to carry big paving stones up and down the mountainside, and they were lured away from their families in villages by men who said they had some good work for them and like that. But the truth of it is, they were just used as beasts of burden. And when these kids, if they would like fall off one of those mountain paths and break a leg, the slaveholders would go down and take the stone, but leave the kid behind, because it was less expensive to go and just get another kid to take that space. Now, here's where we are about slavery in our lives, right? It's all over the place, and even in places that we don't necessarily expect. Here's university students eating voraciously, right, at the cafeteria, but the girders that hold up the building, the cotton in your shirts, tropical hardwoods that go into the musical instruments you play, chocolate and sugar and coffee and beef and fish and shrimp. I've spent a lot of time around shrimp farms in the last few years. Gold, I've been down some gold mines as well, watching all this happen, shoes and cell phones and laptops. There's a lot of it. And that's just the products, because there can also be slavery in some of the services we use. But I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about how these new technologies link together slavery and the products that we have in ways that are sometimes good and sometimes bad. I mean, the criminals use new technologies as well, but then so do us. So do the rest of us who are trying to do anti-slavery work. For example, over here in the UK, one of the areas that we've found a lot of trafficking and enslavement of people are in hand car washes. Now I know, I don't know if you've got some hand car washes in Lincoln, or nail bars where you get your nails done. Uh, but those services were in Great Britain, services that people realized they could lure foreign workers in, they could promise them jobs, and then basically lock them up and use them in ways where they could work in a cash economy and make a good bit of cash out of it. It was actually one of my colleagues at the university who cracked this open about the car washes. And it was simply because he's an economist and a business specialist. And he was walking past one of these hand car washes, and he saw like 6 or 8 men all scrubbing a car at the same time at high speed. And then he saw that the cost of the car wash was something like £5. So, say like $10. So as an economist, he thought, wait a minute, how can you pay people a living wage or even a minimum wage if you're only charging that much and there's sort of 6 or 8 of them working? So he actually came back the next day and sat with a stopwatch and a notepad and realized after watching for a few hours that there was no way these men could be paid not even near a minimum wage, that they they could barely get subsistence out of this. And when they began to do that, they began to ask police to come and look into this. And it turned out to be not just something local in Nottingham, it turned out to be something that was completely all over the country. Though, interestingly, one of the other obvious ones, and it's interesting that just recently in the last couple of weeks, Facebook has been exposed as a place where a lot of recruitment goes on for enslaving people. I mean, some of us have known this for some time. I did work in Norway with the Norwegian government because they were finding that workers from Poland who were coming over, highly skilled workers, welders and electricians, would be going on a Polish Facebook page that was about working in Norway. And on that, there would be some other workers, but there would also be criminals who would be masquerading as employers, and then that would lead them through Facebook. I met with Facebook. We talked about this. This is about 2 or 3 years ago now. And I said, if you would simply just put some appropriate language, and I mean like in Polish on a Polish page that says, hey, be careful because there are people who would might want to recruit you into exploitation. But they never rose to that. They never said they would do that. And now we find out that from some other leaks of Facebook executives that there's been a whole series of other types of ways in which criminality uses Facebook to recruit. On the other hand, after it sounds strange that you would have a safe car wash app on your telephone, on your iPhone or whatever. But one of the things that we popped up with out of our lab was that once we understood the mechanics and economics of enslavement in hand car washes, because we realized these are also happening in lots of other countries as well, we put together an app which allows you, if you just wanted to stand outside of a car wash for 20 minutes and input the data you see going on in the car wash, you would be able to predict with a very high accuracy whether or not it was an honest sort of place or a place that was exploiting workers. So if you're interested and you want to bring it down on your phone and then maybe go around Lincoln and see what's going on with the car washes, it's just called the Safe Car Wash app. And you can see it's on Google Play and the Apple Store and so forth. Now, all of these things are, both the people and the products are coming along these long supply chains. And, I think it's just important to understand that supply chains are very long and they're very complicated. And one of the things that's a real challenge is that those of us who buy things and use things and eat things and so forth that come through the supply chain is that that chain has a complexity to it that is very hard to see if you're standing at the cash register, right? If you're standing at our end, if you're the final recipient of whatever that thing is that's gone all the way around the planet. And one of the things that we have to understand, which is a little bit counterintuitive, and I think especially sometimes for people just coming to the issue, is that you stand at the cash register and you think, well, surely I can make decisions about what I buy, and that will somehow affect all the things that happen in the supply chain. And the answer is yes, it does, but it's about the weight of a grain of sand against a mountain, in that by the time it's reached you, almost all the badness has happened, and all the disguises and subterfuge and concealment has happened as well. It's why it's so important to try to figure out ways to start at the bottom, not the top. In other words, go all the way to where the slavery happens, to the mines in Congo, to the shrimp farms in Bangladesh, and work there, because that's the area which is most likely to be hidden and most likely to be sneaking things into your lives. There's a thing that I suffered from, I know, in the past, which is the assumption that somehow everyone on the other side of the cash register could be part of a guilty supply chain. But I was pure. I was the last person to buy things, sure, but I have good intentions. So there was some idea that like everybody in the chain was bad except me. But of course, the truth is I'm just the last link. I'm the last link in that supply chain. Now, one of the ways that we've been cracking some of these problems, though, and I'm just going to share some of our new work in the lab, is that we're using satellites. We're using a lot of satellite work to understand supply chains and slavery in supply chains, because you can actually see, we believe now, we can see about 40% of the slavery in the world, and especially in supply chains, we can detect using satellite technology from space. The little picture that you see behind that headline is actually a picture from a UNESCO World Heritage Site at the bottom of Bangladesh. It shouldn't have any boats, and it shouldn't have any jetties, and it shouldn't have whatever those little lines are on the left side of the picture that look a little bit like structures or housing or something, which are actually fish drying racks, and where children are used to raise shrimp and prepare fish that ends up being shipped over here. And likewise, one of the things that we get caught up in is, here we are in Brazil watching, and I want to explain how we actually started with these first satellite work, is that in the 90s, I was actually in Brazil and had found how people were enslaved to cut down forests in Brazil and then burn the wood. You could see these little clay ovens behind this chap carrying an enormous garbage can of charcoal up to a truck. They're literally cutting down the forest, turning it into charcoal, not for barbecues, but to feed it into the Brazilian steel industry. Now, you think, well, what's that got to do with me? Well, it's just that the Brazilian steel industry feeds a lot of things in the United States and in Western Europe. But here, I just wanted to show you, when they finally invented Google Earth, I started looking for the places I had been, and I realized, wow, I can see exactly the spaces where I had watched people in slavery in charcoal camps, where you can see the smoke, you can see the little ovens, you can see the totally denuded forests on the right, you can see the yet to be cut forests on the left. And then we began to work with those same kind of ideas now that we have even better satellites, and we can link together the deforestation and link that with local slavery data that makes predictions about where we should be looking. So that's obviously a map of Brazil, and you can see the bits where cutting has been, and the blue bits up in Amazonia where it shouldn't be cut. And here's not Brazil, but just Amazonia. And you can see the purple line at the top is actually the Amazon River and the Amazon River Basin. But the important thing about this satellite image is that the green parts of it, now that it's been colored, the green parts of it are the parts of the Amazon forest which are supposed to be protected forever and haven't been cut. But the yellow parts of this map of Amazonia are the parts of the Amazon forest which are never to be cut, always protected, but are cut and have been cut. And then the purpley magenta bits at the bottom are actually farmland that's not part of the protected forest. But what you can see is how the creeping destruction of the Amazon rainforest has been built on slavery and murder. You can see the lines as the criminals and the enslavement pushes further and further in. You can look into that line just inside the 2018 ring, where there's a ring of red dots, meaning murders around a big blue dot, which means a big number of people have been enslaved. And all of that sitting in the heart of a yellow space, which is in fact an area that criminals have broken into within the Amazon forest and have cut all the trees away. And then actually killed off the workers when they got worn out, buried them in the forests that were left, and began to move on to the next space. This is basically crime scene investigation in the Amazon. I was out with the environmental police, and they were finding, finally, for the first time, they'd been looking for so long time, a whole series of workers who had disappeared. And they had been shot in the head when they got to, we're back to the disposability of workers who have been enslaved, and then buried in the forests, and it took a long time to find them. Where does all this go? All of this charcoal and steel work? Well, this is where it really crosses that line into the space that you say, oh, I get it. Because plumbing fixtures are one of the key exports that go from that industry to the United States and to Western Europe. And likewise, automobile parts are one of the key things fabricated out of that, either in the US or in Brazil and shipped forward. So if you've ever sat in a car or you've ever used, ever washed your hands, there's a good chance you've been close to the slavery in Brazil. Now, I'm going to jump back to those shrimp farms for a minute, because this is also part of the environmental linkage to slavery today. So the green bits that you see in this map, which is down at the bottom of Bangladesh and the bottom of India, is called the Shinderpin's UNESCO World Heritage Site. So this isn't just a special site. It's a bit like the Amazon. It's a bit like the Yellowstone National Park. It's absolutely protected. Laws are all over it. It's got international support through the United Nations and so forth. There shouldn't be anything in this space. It's supposed to be one of the last really wild places on the planet Earth. And because it's an enormous mangrove forest, it's also the largest carbon sink in Asia. And if you're not sure what that means, it just means this area sucks more CO2 out of the air than any other place in all of Asia. So this is a good thing for us. It's like the Amazon forest. And here's a picture that you saw sort of before of what it looks like, that clearly somebody we learned from the satellites has gone in there. But what you're seeing now with those things that look like little buildings on the left side of the screen are in fact fish drying racks. And what's happening is that children have been lured down to work. Their parents have been convinced and maybe paid a little bit on the idea that they're having an advance on a job and they're supposed to have a regular job. But of course, once they're down the river and once they're into this hidden kind of area in the forests, they just disappear. They work them day and night. They work them as fast as they can get the fish processed. They also have them running a shrimp farms there where they produce shrimp that gets frozen and sent over here. And their lives are just pretty awful. they're whipped like this. A very brave Bangladeshi photographer managed to actually get a picture of a modern slave driver beating the kids to make them work faster on the drying racks. It's a remarkable fact that to be able to see it in this day and age. And I show a picture of the tiger here, and it seems like a strange thing to do, but I'm going to tell you why. The reason the Shinderpin's UNESCO World Heritage Site is protected is because it's the last fully open breeding grounds of the Bengal tigers. So it's the home of these amazing animals, right? But when I spoke to the kids who had been in those fish processing camps, and I said, what happens to you there? What health problems do you have? They all said the same thing first, which was they said, oh, we all got diarrhea all the time. And I think it was because they were given really bad food and rotten things to eat. But the second most common thing that every kid I was able to talk to told me was after diarrhea, they said, well, and then I either saw my friend or I knew someone who had another child who had been eaten by a tiger. And I was just thinking, I think I stopped thinking. I think I was frozen up by that, by the idea that children who are enslaved and the second most likely outcome of their mortality in this enslavement was that they were going to be eaten by tigers. But the reason why, and we're into ecological questions, environmental questions, is because if you take tigers are territorial animals, if you invade their territories, if you cut down the trees and you drive away all the animals that they normally eat, the small deer and so forth, but you put in place a new prey animal called little kids, they'll eat the kids. And it was remarkable to me to see this crashing, smashing of slavery and criminal enslavement into the natural world that we're hoping to protect. And we need to do that for 2 or 3 reasons. But you should just know, where does the supply chain end for the products of those camps in the Shinderpins in Bangladesh, in cat food and in frozen shrimp that ends up in your shrimp salads? You can see that cat's a little shocked. I just told them about where his food came from. He looks a little about as concerned as any cat ever gets, I guess. Happily, we've been able to bring satellites to bear in that region, and we were very surprised to discover that there were many more of these slave camps than we thought there were, which you can't miss them if you've got satellites to look for them. But the ones that I had visited as a researcher then led us to be able to discover a whole lot more of them. And we were able to put pressure on the Bangladeshi government, which is corrupt and not a lot has happened, but we're also able to expose it all over the planet. But that satellite work was crucial for that. Now, the whole impact of slavery into environmental destruction, you can see they're cutting down rainforests here, they're cutting down forests there. They're also doing a lot of other things that are very polluting, very dirty, like making bricks, which I'll come to, I think, in a moment. But what it means is this, is that the interaction is actually at a very global scale. But it's a curious interaction because of the relative sizes. You see, if slavery were a country, and let's say it's a country of 40 million people, right? 40.3 million people. That's the population of Algeria. This is not an enormous country. It's actually a little more, but about around the population of California. And we know from the UN calculations that slavery globally basically makes about $150 billion a year in profits, in criminal profits. If we called that the gross, the GDP, right? The gross developing profits of the country, the GDP, the gross income of 150 billion, you say, well, what countries out there have 150 billion? in their GDP. Well, Bulgaria is one, and here's the mind blower for me. The state of Arkansas has a GDP of $150 billion a year. So what would this be? It would be a small, if slavery were a country, it would be a very small, poor country, small and poor. But if you calculate the carbon emissions coming out of the population of 40 million people in slavery around the world, that little country would be the third largest emitter of CO2 in the world after China and the United States. It's larger than any of the European countries. It's larger than any other country than China and the United States. It's about 2.5 billion tons of carbon per year. Now, when we figured that out, I have to say it was mind-blowing to me, and it was also scary to me, but it also began to realize there's something positive to this. I know it doesn't sound positive, but the positive thing is that while some people debate climate change and why some people are not necessarily concerned about that as opposed to other issues, the thing is that climate change and carbon emissions that come from slavery, they're not protecting any industry. They're not, making sure that we have gas for our cars or whatever. They're criminals. And it's actually a bad criminal activity that could be stopped immediately because it's a bad criminal activity. It's illegal in all the places where it happens. In other words, we could dramatically reduce, if we could go in and arrest and act against the crime of slavery in those places where the environmental destruction using slaves is taking place, we could bring to an end abruptly something like 2.5 billion tons of CO2 in the air. How much would that be? That would be almost enough to stop the rise in global CO2 levels, at least to pause it for a while. Here's another graph of exactly the same thing, but if you look across the largest CO2 emitters in the world, you can see China, the United States, and then you can see that that modern slavery is the one that comes in third. It's a distant third, but it's a third. And the next largest is the Russians, and then the Indians and the Japanese and so forth. And remarkably, it would be like taking a couple of major countries off grid if we were suddenly able to reduce that amount of CO2. Now, here's the thing. We know that most of that CO2 is generated by deforestation, criminally based, enslaved, enforced deforestation. But if we then said, well, I bet the people who have been enslaved to tear down forests, some of them, if they want to, might want to be paid to reforest. In other words, to replant the forest they've been forced to destroy. Now, there's something called carbon credits, in which big factories in places like the United States that use and generate carbon can actually pay to it's called an offset to their carbon. And they do it all the time. They do it all the time. And in fact, if you take a trip on a major airline, they'll give you a choice if you want to pay like an extra $5 to offset the carbon that you are generating just by sitting in that airplane and riding that airplane. $27.9 billion in carbon credits if we were able to use all the people who had come out of slavery in the places where deforestation was happening, and we would be able to train them up and get them working and so forth. That would flow into it. And what's powerful about that is that that's more than we estimate it would cost to really bring slavery to an end over a 10 to 20 year period, or get it almost completely wiped out, right? And some of that's already happening. Here are workers who have been enslaved. That's a place where they were forced to cut down in Brazil, down the trees. Now they're being paid to replant. It takes a while, but it's possible. And that kind of work could be happening in Bangladesh. It could be happening in other parts of Africa and so forth. Now, I'm wrapping it up now, but I just want to say, in many ways, and especially since 10 years ago when you saw that TED Talk, we've come a long way. We know so much more about how to pass the laws, how to get to the scene of the crime, how to help people come to freedom, how to help people in freedom grow and build new lives. And I think I want to just say, now we need, right? But notice that I put you first, and the answer why I put you there and the government's last, and it's because every anti-slavery movement, every human rights movement in human history was never solved by governments. Governments come to the table last. They come at the very end and they pass the law and they take all the credit for all the work that's been done, but they usually show up last to the table. And the businesses have to be dragged in along. They will get right when they have to get right. But it's the individuals, the people who feel strongly about freedom and that slavery is a bad thing, and that equality and perhaps preserving the environment and putting even those things together and helping them solve each other. You're the ones who are going to make the real difference. It's going to be you that the businesses follow because you're the consumers. It's going to be you that the governments follow because you're the voters. So I'm just hoping that you understand your power in this, because all the history of all the anti-slavery and human rights movements in the past tell us you can't count on the governments to come up with it and lead, or the businesses. It's got to be us that makes that happen. Okay, I'll stop there. I'll stop my screen sharing.
I like to invite your questions now, and we have a microphone over here on our right here. I'm going to turn our lights back on. There we go. And questions for Dr. Bales. Come on up, and I'd like you to stand behind this microphone here so that Dr. Bales can hear you. I will turn on the microphone. Okay, and come on up to the microphone here. And while they're making their way up, Dr. Bales, really quickly, acting locally here, what one thing today could we do individually to try and reverse the slavery in the world around us and supply chains?
Well, that's a good one. I mean, one is to look carefully at what you're buying and so forth. Sorry, let me answer his question. He just had to ask that question. But the other part of it is, there was actually a class at University of Tennessee that spent a whole semester trying to figure out what was the most effective thing some university students could do to really make a dent in in modern slavery. And at the end of the day, they said, it sounds crazy, but it's really about taking like $5 a month and handing it to a anti-slavery organization, a charity that does work in the developing world. And the reason why is that your $5 isn't very much, but it goes a long way in places like India or Bangladesh or other parts, even Brazil, though not quite as far. And so you suddenly have this multiplier effect that comes from that. And it's true, because when the cost of getting a person out of slavery can be as low as it actually is in the developing world, then, $5 a month from 10 of you means lots of people coming out of slavery every year. Okay, sorry, yes, what's your question?
You said that the hardest way to change supply chains was from the top to the bottom. So I was wondering if simply just not buying from these companies that use slave labor is even helpful.
Oh yeah, of course it's helpful. But of course, the tricky thing is, how do you know that this company is using slave labor? And I have to say, sometimes the companies themselves don't know. Now, I'm not saying they shouldn't know. I'm just saying sometimes they don't know. And the reason why is because, let's start thinking about electronics for a minute. It's the criminals at the bottom of the supply chain, where the mines are. They work really hard to hide the criminality and the origin of those minerals. So you can buy minerals if you wanted to start making electronics on the world market, and it'll say they come from this country or that country, that it's from Australia, it's from the mines in Australia, but it could all be a lie. It's all very tricky because the criminals are making a lot out of it. So yeah, if you have suspicions, don't buy. And I use an app on my phone called Good on You, which when I think about buying some stuff, I'll just put the name of the company in on Good on You, and it'll tell me, oh yeah, this company's fine, or they just don't tell us enough. So you might want to be careful about this outfit and so forth. Does that help? Great, thanks.
We have another gentleman, please.
All right. So how exactly were you able to organize and do all of the work that you've done, going to all these different countries, finding out about where these criminals are doing all the work and stuff, even before satellites? It just all seems like so much work, and it's super interesting to me.
Well, it was a lot of work, I have to admit. And when I started doing this work in the 90s, and primarily I went to 5 countries and went kind of undercover in some of them. It was like doing ethnography, like doing anthropological work. I would get with people that lived there, that I knew, that I got to know well, and I needed people to help me guide because I can't speak 26 languages and all that sort of thing. And so it was just hard work and focus. And I'll tell you, some of it meant just being in a place for weeks and weeks on end, and occasionally being in a place for weeks on end undercover. In other words, saying I was somebody that I wasn't, right? Or kind of pulling the wool over the eyes of people who made bricks or who were involved in other types of slave-based work, so that they wouldn't understand what I was really doing there. I'd have somebody else to vouch for me and so forth. It's a slog, right? And but once you've done it once, in a sense, once you understand that part of a supply chain or that kind of exploitation, you don't have to go back over and over again. Right? Then the question becomes, how do we intervene? How do we make the difference? How do we do that? And in a sense, that's even harder work, because then you've got to stick with people year in and year out and figure out all the best ways to help people to find their way to freedom, or to open the door to freedom. Yeah. If you want to, the first book I published about this was called Disposable People. And it's all about my trips into all of those countries and all of the chicanery that had to happen. So if you're interested in how that works, have a look at that book. And even in the back of the book, there's a little appendix about, here's the methodologies, here's the research methodologies I use to pull this off. I don't put those in the story because it kind of messes up the story to stop and talk about research methods.
That was very informative. Thank you so much.
Certainly.
Okay, so other comments, questions? Please take the mic. Thank you.
What type of work do you do in the Rights Lab?
Oh, so the Rights Lab is a research lab. And I'm not the director, even though I was promoted a moment ago. I'm the research director. But there's so Zoe Trott is our actually big chief director. But what we've done is assemble a number of researchers who are concerned with modern slavery. So we have different teams, and one team, for example, as I mentioned, what we haven't really explained, works on machine learning and artificial intelligence and algorithm writing and ways to build predictive models where we can use all kinds of information from different countries to predict where we should be looking more closely. There's a whole team that does the satellites work, which you've seen. There's a whole team that works on things like brain imaging, because we also spend a lot of time working with and being led by survivors of slavery. So we have a number of survivor scholars who now have PhDs, who have been in slavery earlier in their lives, but now they're research scientists, and they're helping us to really understand what it means to be in slavery, but also helping us to really understand how best to help people come out of the trauma of slavery. So there's that part. And then there's the economics and supply chain part. There's a whole team just for that. So it's called the Rights Lab. You can look it up online and you can see the different teams and what they do. There's a whole team that just works on the laws and the policy side. And then we actually have another team that governments can call on and say, would you do this piece of research for us? We're trying to figure something out. So it's a broad-based lab, almost like a public health lab, almost like an epidemiological lab. You know, when you face a pandemic, I hear there's one over there too, over in Nebraska. But anyway, when you face a pandemic, you actually, and you start at the bottom of this, and you don't know quite where you're going. You check the water, you check the air, you check people's food, you check what's happening with, you know, like face-to-face kisses or whatever. You know, you begin to have to work through all the possible ways that you can address and understand and measure something. Well, we're in a sense treating modern slavery like a pandemic, only one that we barely understand and one that changes over time, like viruses do. And we're trying to find all that we can to get ahead of it. That's what the labs does. I hope that helped. Did that help?
Head nodding. Yes, thank you. Others, comment, question? Yes, please step to the mic. Yep.
How a country like China versus a country like India with equivalent, like near equivalent populations have such a disparate number of slaves in them relatively. Like India's in the dark red and China's in very pale yellow. So how does that arise necessarily?
Well, that's a good question, and I'm gonna own up to one kind of fact about that map, which is we know our data on China is not as good as our data on India. And that's because the Chinese are very keen to keep out the researchers. And it's also very difficult to measure the enslavement that goes on in China, in large part because a large part of the slavery in China is not like that of India. It's not individual criminals or local tough guys who are enslaving people into brick kilns or farms or something like that. In China, it's the country itself. The government itself is enslaving significant parts of its own population. But when you've got a government doing it, they can control the access to what you see, what you don't see, and the information like that. So we all have heard about the Uyghurs now, but the Uyghurs for a long time and a bunch of other people who are minority groups in China have been separated, segregated, arrested, imprisoned, all completely, fundamentally illegally, and are being used as slave labor but in Chinese factories and in Chinese food processing and like that. So I'm actually just gonna take the blame for your question, right? And say our measurements are the best we can get, but they're not good enough for China. And they're probably not good enough for any country because it's a hard crime to measure. But I think that's what's going on. I think that's what's the key. I think the key reason you're seeing these differences is that you've got good old, well, I won't say good old, you've got the standard versions of criminal slave taking and slave exploitation in India. And then in China, you've got some of that as well. But you've also got the government and all the power of the government lined up to conceal the state-sponsored slavery that goes on there. It's one that we should understand better as Americans because we had state-sponsored slavery in the United States from 1867 to about 1910 in a big way in the southern states. Hundreds and thousands of African Americans were enslaved in exactly the same way of state-sponsored slavery that they use in China now, where they arrest people on completely bogus charges, and then they basically sell them off to factories where they work for nothing and can't leave. Does that help?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. I think we're just about out of time. So one more time, Dr. Kevin Bales. Thank you so much, Kevin,
Thank
for
you.
joining us. And I hope we can do this again sometime. I hope you come visit our lovely campus one of these days. We'd love to show you around and
I haven't been there in a long time, but I'd love to come back.